Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Ezekiel chapter 4, a symbolic siege, in our continuing study of the Old Testament prophets. Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 1, God is speaking to Ezekiel, and calling him to engage in what we might think of as street art or street drama. Perhaps you've been at certain places in certain cities where there was someone who was acting out a story out on the street. And that's exactly what Ezekiel is going to be doing. Chapter 4, verse 1. Now, you son of man, get yourself a brick, place it before you, and inscribe a city on it. And he's to write the words on this brick, Jerusalem. That is, in case you didn't get it, the brick is going to represent Jerusalem. Verse 2, then lay a siege against it, build a siege wall, raise up a ramp, pitch camps, and place battering rams against it all around. That is, he's setting up his own little tiny war game. And he's setting Jerusalem in the middle, and it's labeled so that you can tell what it is. And then he is conducting like a miniature siege. He's building little tiny camps. He's making little battering rams, and he is acting out a siege against the city of Jerusalem. Verse 3, then get yourself an iron plate and set it up as an iron wall between you and the city. So he's got the city laid out. He's going through the motions of conducting a siege against this little pretend city. And now there is an iron plate between him and the city, and set your face toward it so that it is under siege, and besiege it. This is a sign to the house of Israel. So he's acting this out so that Israel can see, and remember, portions of Israel are there in Mesopotamia where they have been dispossessed of their land and moved to this location. Verse 4, as for you, here's the rest of the story. Here's the rest of the acting out part. As for you, lie down on your left side and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel on it. You shall bear their iniquity for the number of days that you lie on it. For I have assigned to you a number of days corresponding to the years of their iniquity. 390 days. Now notice, each day is going to represent a year. Each day of their sinfulness is going to represent a year. And there's been 390 days, which tells me there's 390 years. Thus you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. Now, why are they lying on their left? I suppose you could think of as Israel on the left and Judah on the right, and the right hand and the left hand and honor and things like that. But perhaps there's an easier explanation. You see, when we look at maps, we usually put north at the top. One of the most ancient maps that we have of the land of Israel, called the Madaba Map, located actually in Jordan, and it lays out on a floor a big giant map of Israel. But when you look at the way the labels are oriented, you can tell that the map is oriented where at the top of the map isn't north, but it is east. And to the Jewish mind, east was sort of the front side of anything. The east was out in front. And so if you're facing toward the east, what's on your right will be south, what is on your left will be north. And that's sort of what you see here. Notice you're going to lie down on your north side. That to the north was Israel, to the south was Judah. And you're going to bear the iniquity. 390 days you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. Now, that 390 days, I probably ought to mention that when you read the Greek Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of the Hebrew text, it reads not 390, but 190. And of course, you ask the question, well, is the Old Hebrew text, when I say the Old Hebrew text, that's the Masoretic text. But more often than not, it's represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well, versus the Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew text. Usually, I won't say about in this case, but usually it's not as good as going back to the Hebrew text. But there is a scribal difference. Somehow it crept into the text. Now, when we look at the 390 years, assuming that the Masoretic text is correct, I would suggest that goes from around 929. You say, well, what happened there? I'll get to that in a second. Down to 539 BC. That would be roughly about 390 years. Around 929 BC is when Jeroboam the first, this is after the breakup of the kingdom of Israel, where it was separated into north and south. So now you had a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. It was around this time that Jeroboam the first established a different way to worship God. He said, instead of going down to Jerusalem, I'm going to set up these two golden calves. Sort of reminds you of what Aaron did back when the Jews were in the wilderness. And Jeroboam says, well, it was good enough for Aaron. It's going to be good enough for you. One will be at Bethel. One will be at Dan. Worship there instead of going to Jerusalem to worship. And he established that. And then move forward 390 years, and you have what will be the end of the Babylonian captivity. That's when Cyrus the Great takes Babylon. And the very first thing he does, he decrees that the Jews are allowed to return to their own land. So that would fit if that's what we are to see it. Now, remember, I said the Septuagint, though, reads it as 190 years. Well, there again, if that's correct, and I'm not saying that it is, but if it is, again, we could go back to 929 BC and again go roughly about 190 years to 740, 739 BC, right around there, is when the northern kingdom begins to go into captivity. You say, wait a minute, begins to go into captivity? I thought the northern part of the country went into captivity in the year 721 BC. Well, that's when it completed, but the process began about 20 years earlier, when the northernmost tribes of Israel were carried into captivity, that is, the tribes that were around Galilee, by Assyria. The rest of the tribes weren't taken, the rest of that section or of that country wasn't taken until 721 BC. But in 539 BC, the process began. And so either way might fit. You can sort of see why maybe the folks from the Septuagint, whichever way is right. I'm not going to take sides here. But again, both of these readings will fit nicely. Now, the prophecy goes on, chapter 4, verse 6. When you have completed these, you shall lie down a second time, but on your right side. So left side, that was a lot of time, whether it was 190 days or 390 days, whether it was half a year or a little bit over a year. That's a long time. I don't know about you. When I lay down, I usually like to sort of roll from one side to the other. To me, it would almost be torture to make me lie on only one side. And I don't have any doubt that Ezekiel eventually became a little uncomfortable. And the point is, he is sharing God's discomfort because God has been bearing up under their iniquity all this time. Chapter 4, verse 6, when you have completed these, you shall lie down a second time, but on your right side and bear the iniquity of the house of Judah. You see, before it was the northern kingdom of Israel, now it's the southern kingdom of Judah. I have assigned it to you for 40 days. Again, it's a day for each year, so the same idea. Now, what does this 40 days represent? And people have come up with all sorts of suggestions. I have tried on all sorts of suggestions. After all, when you talk about 40 days and 40 years, there were wilderness wanderings. The Israelites were in the wilderness for 40 years. And you had the reigns of Saul and David and Solomon were 40 years. And I'm sure that there's other things that take 40 years. And none of these really seems to fit here. Until I look at two things. First of all, I have the beginning of the ministry of Jeremiah, starts around 626 BC and goes down to 586 BC. So I suppose that might be an interesting fit, but there's nothing here that connects it to Jeremiah. So I'm not sure that really works either. But one that I wouldn't initially think of looking at, because I would just assume Ezekiel is prophesying something that's going to be fulfilled in his day. And maybe the Jeremiah thing works at least as a intermediate fulfillment. But if I go forward to the period of the New Testament, then I go not from the beginning of Jeremiah's ministry to the destruction of the temple, but I see a different destruction of the temple in the New Testament era. There I have the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. Remember, he comes and he ministers and then he dies upon the cross and is rejected. And 40 years later, I have the other destruction of the temple, the other destruction of Jerusalem. And that takes place right about 40 years. And I can't help but think, coincidence? Maybe not. Chapter 4, verse 7 goes on, then you shall set your face toward the siege of Jerusalem with your arm bared and prophesy against it. Now behold, I will put ropes on you so that you cannot turn from one side to the other until you have completed the days of your siege. I'm going to make it so that you have to fulfill this acting out of what I've been acting out for all these hundreds of years. Verse 9, but as for you, take wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt, put them in one vessel and make them into bread for yourself. You shall eat it according to the number of the days that you lie on your side, 390 days. The number's repeated. Notice the number again, the 390 days. Verse 10, your food which you shall eat shall be 20 shekels. And again, whether it was 390 or 190, he's going to be on the same diet for quite a long time. Your food which you shall eat shall be 20 shekels a day by weight. You shall eat it from time to time. That is not an incredibly rich diet. The water you shall drink shall be the sixth part of a hin by measure. Again, he's living on what we could call sort of bread and water, and not a lot of bread and not a lot of water. You shall drink it from time to time. You shall eat it as a barley cake, having baked it in their sight. Over human dung. Now that's just gross. You see, are you sure? Yes, look at the response of Ezekiel. Verse 13, then the Lord said, thus will the sons of Israel eat their bread unclean among the nations where I banish them. But I said, here's Ezekiel's response, I said, Lord God, behold, I have never been defiled. For from my youth until now, I have never eaten what died of itself or was torn by beasts, nor is any unclean meat. And let's just face it, cooking this food over human dung, that's gross. That is unclean. And he says, nor has any unclean meat ever entered my mouth. And Ezekiel actually objects to the instructions of God. And so, because of his objection, God says, well, okay, let's change that. He said to me, see, I will give you cow's dung in place of human dung, over which you'll prepare your bread. That's slightly better. It's still a bit gross, but he changes it up just a bit. Verse 16, moreover, he said to me, son of man, behold, I am going to break the staff of bread in Jerusalem, and they will eat bread by weight and with anxiety. They're going to be looking at what they eat and say, oh, gross, and drink water by measure and in horror, because bread and water will be scarce, and they will be appalled with one another and waste away in their iniquity. They're going to be eating some awful things there in Jerusalem. And so, Ezekiel, you're going to share just a bit in their discomfort. It's not going to be as bad as they have it, but I want you to feel the discomfort and portray that to those who are watching. Now, this reminds me of the one who took our hunger, our thirst upon himself. You remember how at the beginning of his ministry, he goes out into the wilderness. And for 40 days, 40, there's that number again, he hungers and he thirsts as he bears our hunger and thirst. And then at the end of his ministry, as he dies upon the cross for our uncleanliness, for our sin, for our wrongdoing, for our dishonor. What did he say upon the cross? Nothing about hunger, but he says, I thirst. He suffered our thirst. He suffered our hunger so that we might be filled with regards to hunger. Remember what he said in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed is he who hungers and thirsts for righteousness. When we come to him, we find our hunger and our thirst. I'm not talking about physical hunger and thirst, but our spiritual hunger and our spiritual thirst, because he said, I'm the bread of life. He said, anyone who drinks of me will never thirst. He fills our spiritual thirst, our spiritual hunger with himself as we partake in faith of him.